Hi, y'all. This is chapter 10. So, in this chapter, we're going to cover the health and risk of exercise and physical activity. And so, in this particular chapter, we're going to talk about what kind of risk are there associated with physical activity and exercise. We would be not doing a good job. We wouldn't be telling you the whole picture if we didn't say there are some risks that come with exercise and physical activity. There definitely are. And so, we want to talk about those in this chapter. Um, and so, kind of again your objectives, what you should be able to look at. And so, what are the risks associated with musculoskeletal injuries? Can we prevent these? Is there a risk for things like cardiac death or heart attacks during exercise? And so, some good questions. And again, not off limits. We would be reminiscent to say that exercise is good for everything and there are no risks. Well, that just wouldn't be right. And so, there are some risks that come to exercise that are related to it. And so, first of all, there are risk factors that may put you more or less likely to be at risk for injuries or certain things happening during exercise. And so, one of the major things we see as a risk for exercise and physical activity is what we call a musculoskeletal injury. So, an injury to your muscle or your skeletal system. A lot of times, these injuries come because of physical activity. Not a lot of times people are just sitting there and then all of a sudden their leg snaps. That would not be good. Or if it did, it was probably due to some accident, something falling on it, or an accident happening. It doesn't just happen just sitting there. But during exercise, someone is more likely to fall and break their leg, or they may actually tear a muscle while running, but just sitting there is very unlikely to happen. And so there are risk factors associated with that. Some are modifiable. So the amount and type of physical activity you currently do, some activities are more likely for certain types of musculoskeletal injuries than others, and also how much we do them. Some activities, if we do them too much, we're putting certain muscles and certain body parts at risk for an injury. We know that smoking cigarettes or smoking anything to that fact puts you more at risk for a musculoskeletal injury. It plays with the chemistry of them and makes it where they're a little bit more stiff and a little bit more easily injured. If you have a low physical fitness level, so especially those that are first starting out doing physical activity and exercise, they're more likely to suffer an injury because their bodies aren't able to handle the stresses that they're put under, which is why we always talk about start slow and progress slowly so your body can actually handle these without being injured. So the improper use of protective equipment or not doing something right, so maybe you're doing activity even as simple as running. If you're not doing it with proper mechanics, this can definitely cause an injury. Or if you're not using protective equipment, like say a helmet, correctly. And then finally, adverse environmental conditions. So especially the biggest one that comes to mind would be if you are running and it's really cold outside, and maybe it's early in the morning still, and maybe there was some rain the day before, and so there's some ice that has developed, and that could happen. Or if it is raining, everything becomes slick, and maybe you fall and have an injury that way as well. So those are the modifiable, but there are also things that play a role in musculoskeletal injuries that you don't really have control over. So age. As you get older, your joints actually become a little bit less plastic, so they become more stiff, and so that can lead to an injury. Your muscles become a little bit more stiff and can play into an injury as you age. Sex. So some injuries tend to happen to some sexes more than others. Knee injuries, we tend to see a higher amount in females, so you can kind of keep that in mind. If you've had a history of an injury in a particular spot. So I have broken a couple of my fingers and toes over the years, and so they're a little bit weaker, and I've had some issues in those areas ever since, and they're more likely to get injured now. So one of the fingers I broke really bad, it gets injured very easily. Things that I can do with trauma that other fingers get, and I just shake off. That particular finger that really got injured has a lot of trouble if it gets hit in the wrong way. The amount of physical activity in the past that you've done, so the history of that, again, not doing a lot and then jumping into a lot could lead to an injury. You can have anatomical things that play a role in injury. So I have several people I know that have shoulder injuries, like they pop out of socket and they have issues with their shoulders. And they've had it for as long as they can remember, sheerly because of the way that their shoulder developed and the way their shoulder structure is. It's makes it more likely they're injured, and now that they have a history of injuries, it continues to compound on each other. And there are environmental and external conditions that sometimes we just don't have control over that lead to those issues as well. So when we look at that, we do want to look at the risk of injuries when it comes to physical activity. And so what you have here is you have kind of that dark black line is kind of your baseline, zero risk of injury, kind of like the normal risk of injury of anything you do. The blue bar shows that for all activities, regardless of when you look at them, there is, you know, a lower risk of injury. And so you have a insufficiently active group and an active group. So basically think about people who aren't that active versus people who are that active. You can see the green bar is non-activity, so non-sport. So think something that isn't active at all. Your risk of injury goes down below kind of baseline, goes below zero, because activities of daily living, there is still some risk of injury. And then what you see is the red line. So physical activity in sports, when people participate in those, their risk of injury can go up tremendously. But what's really cool is the fact that as you are more physically active and you participate in things more, we see that the risk of injury actually goes down by a lot. And so this big, tall red bar in the inactive group says that, yeah, their bodies aren't as accustomed to activity, and so sometimes that is going to lead to the fact that they're more likely to get injured. But as their body gets more accustomed to these requirements on their body, they have less of a chance of getting an injury. It's still higher than baseline, but it's there. And so when we look at those, we also have to talk about the fact that there can actually be things like sudden cardiac death and heart attacks that occur due to exercise as well. And so all of these things play a factor in this. And so this may scare some people off of activity, but what we do know is that typically the benefits we receive from exercise will outweigh any kind of risk that is associated from musculoskeletal injuries or sudden cardiac death or a heart attack of itself, because the benefits we see are so much greater than the potential risk that we have, because those risks are there, but they're not tremendously high like our health risks are when we are not active. And so when we look at the sudden cardiac death, over a 24-hour period, the risk of cardiac arrest or who remains inactive is actually way higher than the average risk for someone who is habitually active. So what we're saying here is that in a 24-hour period, someone who is inactive, their risk for having cardiac arrest or their heart stopping, having sudden cardiac death, is much, much, much higher than someone who is physically active on a regular basis. And so the risk for cardiac arrest is far higher for those who are active, okay, immediately after the period of physical activity. So right as someone is physically active and right as they finish being physically active, the risk for someone having a cardiac arrest or sudden cardiac death is very, very high. But then that risk actually comes to be lower than baseline. It becomes lower than someone who is sedentary. So for a short period of time, the person who is active has a very high risk of having a cardiac event happen. But afterwards, they have a lower probability of that cardiac event happening. And when you average those out, it's actually more beneficial to be active and take that small period of sudden cardiac event happening than being sedentary and having that risk remain high throughout your entire day. And so all this simply means that the overall benefit of physical activity far outweighs any short-term risk that may occur from that physical activity occurring. And so what you can see here is showing kind of as well that the initial period of a myocardial infarction or a heart attack occur very short, like in a short period of time when you start exercise. So it's the risk of having a heart attack, and then on the x-axis you have hours of exertion prior to the onset of a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. So what we're saying here is that within your first hour of being active, having physical activity, we see the highest risk of heart attack. And then after that, those risks go down to some low levels, much, much lower levels than the first hour. And so if you make it past the first hour of activity, we know the odds of you having any kind of myocardial infarction, heart attack are very, very, very low. And so that's another thing we plan on here as well, is the time factor of when should we be looking for these things if they are going to occur, and it tends to be within the first hour of activity. This, I think, is a really cool chart explaining what I talked about above. couple slides ago, and it's the risk of a cardiac event, a cardiac arrest, so sudden cardiac death, literally dying from your heart stopping during physical activity and during rest. And so what this shows basically on the y-axis is your risk of having sudden cardiac death happen, and this is through basically a 24-hour day. The blue line here is for a sedentary person, and so their risk remains the same. If you're inactive, physically inactive, your risk for sudden cardiac arrest or your heart stopping is the same throughout the day, and that can be seen by the straight blue line. It is there. For someone who is active, okay, so for someone who is active, we look at their risk at every hour of the day, and so that's the red line. So each hour of the day, we see that their risk is much lower than that of the blue person, except for the hour or two that they exercise, okay? And what we see is that they have a baseline of they're going throughout their normal day, and then they get to the point where they exercise, and their risk for sudden cardiac arrest or cardiac arrest, their heart stopping, goes up tremendously, and it actually goes above the risk of that person who is sedentary. And then after their exercise, and a short while after their exercise, we see that comes back down to their kind of resting levels of the day, and their risk for cardiac arrest is very low. And so you can see that this period of increased cardiac arrest risk occurs for a short period of time. And yes, it is higher than the sedentary person, but it's really not that much higher than the sedentary person's average risk across the entire day. And so what if you look at this throughout that particular person, if we average all that out, their average risk is the green dotted line, which is much, much, much lower than the blue sedentary person. And we're saying the benefit you see from that short little time of physical activity far outweighs the risk of not being physically active. We just need to be a little bit more cognizant that that could be an issue during that 1-2 hours of the day, and the rest of the day we get to basically not really worry about it much at all. And so that's kind of what this is showing. And so that's kind of what this chapter wants to look at, is the fact that there are risks with physical activity, but typically those risks can be mitigated with certain aspects, and typically the risks that are there aren't as severe as the health outcomes from not being physically active. We'd rather someone take the small risk, and let's be aware of them and try to prevent them and be ready to deal with those if need be during the activity, and reap the benefit of being physically active, because it's so much, helps our health so much more than the small risk of getting injured or having a heart attack. So that kind of wraps up chapter 10. We can kind of now, with all of these chapters put together, chapters 5 through 10, get a good picture of how physical activity can affect our health in many different areas. If you guys have questions, please email me. And yeah, thanks for listening to this lecture.